Welcome, everyone. My name is Melissa Weddle. I'm the director for the Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research. I will be co-presenting today with my colleague, Dr. Alina Biggert. She can introduce herself real quick and say hi.
Hi, everybody. Alina Biggert. I'm a social scientist and a research faculty at the University of Montana.
Great. Thank you. Welcome to our research roundup on the state of short-term rentals. We have started these research roundups as a way when we finish out reports to give just some high-level information. We record these and put them on our YouTube so folks can come visit them later. And then once we finish the presentation, we stop the recording. And if there are any questions or discussions, we open it up for that as well. So I will go ahead and get started. So for those of you who don't know us, we are ITRR. We were established in 1987 at the University of Montana's W.A. Franke College of Forestry and Conservation. We have spent almost 40 years serving as Montana's trusted research arm. Our mission is to conduct rigorous and impartial research that empowers the tourism and recreation industries to make informed decisions in planning, marketing, policy, and management. As part of the university, Dr. Biggert and I are also research professors, and that we have the highest academic integrity, ensuring transparency for our research. Everything is available 24/7, 365 on our website. So regardless of whether you're a business owner, land manager, a community leader, part of a citizen group, we are here and proud to serve you. So today we're going to go over a little bit of the background, how we got here, the research purpose, the methods. Alina will present the qualitative results and I'll present the quantitative results, and then we'll go over some of the conclusions. As you can well imagine, this is a complicated research project and has a lot of nuances in it. So short-term rentals, commonly facilitated through platforms like Airbnb and Vrbo, have expanded rapidly across Montana in recent years and really across the world, but particularly between 2019 and now through the pandemic. This period coincided with major shifts in tourism behavior, travel preferences, and housing demand, also with pressures from the pandemic. Short-term rentals offered flexible lodging options for visitors and have become an increasingly important component of Montana's tourism economy, especially in areas known for outdoor recreation, national park, and scenic amenities. However, their growth has raised concerns among residents, planners, and policymakers about potential impacts on housing affordability, availability, and neighborhood stability. While short-term rentals are often discussed as a statewide issue, what we have found is their distribution effects are highly uneven. Tourism-driven counties such as Gallatin, Flathead, Park account for a disproportionate amount of short-term rental activity, reflecting both visitor demand and amenity-driven development patterns. In contrast, many rural and non-tourism oriented counties experience relatively little short-term rental pressure. This uneven growth has contributed to localized housing pressures, particularly during peak visitor seasons when short-term rental occupancy is at its highest and housing supply is most concentrated. Tourism short-term rentals has often been blamed for increasing housing prices. However, it's important to recognize that these STRs operate within a broader context and a complicated housing situation. And so we are very proud of what you're seeing on the screen right now. We spent a lot of time as researchers thinking through kind of these housing pressures that are happening in Montana. And I think there were a lot of sound bites that tourism was to blame. That's part of this report, spending a lot of time thinking through that. But as you can see, the housing pressure and context is defined by a unique combination of high tourism activity, population growth during the pandemic, and really limited housing supply. So when you look at this, thinking about, it was really we would argue that there wasn't a strong recovery from 2008, right? So thinking about that housing recession for some of you on here, that's when we bought our first home. But you already had a housing demand, especially in Montana going into the pandemic. You saw an increase in construction shortages, construction workers, housing supplies during the pandemic. You really saw that. You really saw prices increase. We saw an increase in cash buyers, and whether those were individuals moving from other states or equity coming in and buying houses for cash and flipping them or holding on to them. And then remote work, right? Uncoupling work from its location had an enormous impact. And then you put that into this larger cycle of amenity migration. People moved to places where they could be outside and have public lands around them. You saw a population growth. And then you did see this short-term rental growth and increase in tourism during this time. And then, of course, the pandemic itself. And so it's important to note that this is a very broad and complicated context, and understanding kind of the nuanced housing is essential for us, like crafting these effective and locally appropriate policy responses. So I am going to turn it over to Alina for the middle, and then I will come back.
Thank you, Melissa. So some of you may know that we published an earlier study on the state of short-term rentals in 2020. So when we the first time looked at the state of those rentals and interviewed a lot of city and county officials, also did an online panel when we understood the perspectives of those people who rent those places and visitors as well. So that was a very interesting study, and we received a lot of questions. And one of the main questions we received after that report was, okay, so what is the connection to housing? So how does it impact availability of housing and long-term rental market and all those pressing issues? And so that was one of the reasons why we wanted to dive deeper into this research. And we wanted a few years later to investigate the evolution of short-term rental market in Montana, and especially after COVID-19 pandemic and all those things that Melissa talked about, the population growth and the amenity migration, and this remote work becoming so popular and common among so many people. So we wanted to specifically look at the state of short-term rentals after all those forces. So what we wanted to do for this research is also to explore the changes since 2020 in regulations, in benefits and negative impacts that potentially are there, and specifically look into housing. So the methods for this research, a mixed methods approach. So what we did, we conducted interviews with selected city and town officials in several communities across Montana. We also looked at AirDNA data. We worked with an economist who tracked short-term rental listings from Airbnb and VRBO. Specifically, we looked at types and numbers of property listed, how many days they were reserved, looked at activities and seasonality, and also looked at specifically the housing data. So used annual statistics from the Census Bureau, and we tried to link those two sources, AirDNA data and housing data, to calculate what share of Montana's housing stock is actually being used as short-term rentals, and identify this activity and seasonality. So specifically about qualitative methods, you can see here that we focused on key large cities, tourism communities, and small towns. So this is the same classification that we used for our earlier report. For this report, we only interviewed representatives, experts from those 11 communities here. We try to be diverse in terms of geography and in terms of type of the community. So you can just see a quick map here who we talked to. And then in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about the results. So you can go to the next one, Melissa. Thank you. So results, tracking and trends. So we asked about if people actually are tracking short-term rentals, and here we see definitely a difference since our report in 2020. People are tracking a little bit better now, and we are, I'm going to talk about this. There are specific software systems that are used, not everywhere, but specifically larger communities and tourism communities have more tools now to track that growth. So however, smaller communities, small towns reported lacking any formal mechanism to track or regulate short-term rentals. So we also saw some shifts between short-term rentals and long-term rental use. So a lot of people tried short-term rentals, and although it does bring more money, it also a lot of maintenance, a lot of like cleaning and changes. So we heard that a lot of people started to do long-term rental instead. So, but definitely heard that the numbers increased specifically in tourism communities and some larger communities as well. So this is about tracking trends. I'm going through this pretty quickly. So the next one is regulatory approaches. So we asked about regulations, the same question as we asked 5, 6 years ago. So we see also very wide range of approaches there. We all know that on the state level, public accommodation license is required, and it is enforced in most communities, although in smaller counties, not like tourism specific counties, sometimes people are not really checking that regularly, although also this is a requirement everywhere. So in addition to that, a variety of different approaches, local business license, special use permit, fire inspections, occupancy limits, specific accessibility disclosures, caps on short-term rentals, specifically in tourism-heavy communities, how like percentage, it could be 2% or 5%, where truly short-term rentals are allowed, not everywhere. And things like good neighbor policy, so specific guidelines that were developed, also something that we haven't heard when we did our earlier study. So some communities specifically developed those guidelines to guide that process. However, many small towns mentioned that for them it's still pretty new, and the only thing they do is this public accommodation license. And this quote here, no need to regulate for the sake of regulating, but this is again to emphasize small town in not tourism community. So the next one is benefits. So as many of you are aware of that, there are many benefits that short-term rentals provide, and we heard that flexibility, of course, for families, for people who need bigger space, who need kitchen. This is a big win. Diverse lodging options, economic benefits to communities, specific tourism benefits to also communities that do not see a lot of tourism. Think Eastern Montana, think some rural context. Temporary housing for workers. So this is also something new that we haven't heard much, although I'm sure that was around. But nurses, temporary workers in the specific communities, that was actually brought up several times this round of interviews, and I could hear that a lot of people actually welcomed that opportunities, which is temporary, to support workers. And I'll talk about this later, but there's a big difference owner-occupied and non-owner occupied, and approaches, I believe, should be very different. But if it's truly owner-occupied, that helps the community, helps those residents, that is one thing. If it's just for the investment, somebody from out of state came and started renting and buying all these properties, of course, there's a lot of negative sentiment around that. So this is very briefly benefits, and now concerns. Of course, there were many concerns that were brought up, and this reduced housing affordability and availability, something that we heard 5 years ago. We definitely heard this again now. And again, what I just talked about, what is rented and how it is rented makes a big difference. How, like this quote here, the middle one, how you rent makes a big impact on your neighbors and on the image of your town. So when they are used for medical staffing, the community supports them. When they're just for the short-term stays, entertainment, this is very different, and this is where frustration arises. And of course, neighborhood disturbances, noise, parking, frequent tenant turnover, all this was brought up the same as 5 years ago. And the last one I'm going to talk about is specifically, we asked about reflections of housing. So those selected communities, we asked them to share with us, like, how do they think? Does it really affect that? And it was really interesting what we found. Of course, there were concerns, but almost everybody talked about that this is just one of many factors that influencing Montana housing market. So many other forces are at play there: property costs, construction expenses, in-migration, all those things that Melissa mentioned earlier. So definitely they perceive it as a concern. And I'm going to read just a couple of quotes here. Many people do the short-term rental just because it's convenient, and those units would probably just sit empty otherwise. People recognize there is an appropriate place for short-term rentals. It is about finding that balance. And this is one of my main takeaways from this study, that this is very context specific, and each community needs to find its own approach to balancing it and find that balance. And the last one I'm just going to say here, our data shows that short-term rentals aren't a primary or even significant impediment on housing affordability, but we monitor the market closely so we can make quick policy changes if needed. So also something that I really want to emphasize, that this monitoring is really important to find this balance and actually to be proactive if we're reaching that tipping point that we can see those really negative impacts. I'll turn it over back to Melissa to talk about quantitative methods.
Thank you, Alina. That was great. It's so interesting to hear how different communities have different perspectives on it. I'm going to talk about the quantitative portion. If you go to our report, there are lots of tables and charts. We've condensed this really small, but I think it's important to explain what we did and the different approaches that we have. We linked two sources to work closely together. So we did work with AirDNA again. That pulls all of Airbnb and Vrbo, as well as the U.S. Census Bureau housing statistics. And so these are some of the most reliable data that we had. To better estimate the true housing impact of short-term rentals, the analysis applied a series of filters that distinguish between different types of listings. We evaluated 4 different scenarios. We looked at all short-term rental properties, and I'm going to talk about a challenge with that. And then full property listings that resemble traditional housing, properties rented for at least 60 days per year, and properties rented for 120 days per year. These scenarios help differentiate between occasional or supplemental short-term rental use, properties operating more like dedicated vacation rentals. We looked at maps, charts, and time series analysis to illustrate growth trends, peak season impacts, and geographic variation. So something I want to cover is that short-term listings did increase by 55% across the state during this time period. But I want to point out that if you pull this information from AirDNA, it includes everything. It includes a field that you can put a tent down or your camper van. It might include a shared room. It could include a barn loft. It could include a teepee. So none of these are what we would consider replacing a year-round long-term rental. So when we took all of that out, it's sorted down to about 8,000. So when you see this, it's not like, oh, there are 12,000 houses for rent in Montana. That is actually not true. And so that's a nuance with the data. I think about Alina and I when we got this data in Excel format. When you see this, it's a lot to look at. So that is something that we need to consider. And so when you kind of narrow it down to that, then you start to look at what percent of the housing stock that this is. What we realize is this growth has been highly concentrated in a small number of tourism-driven counties. Again, particularly Gallatin, Flathead, and Park. You're going to continue to hear this. On average, short-term rentals account for roughly 2.4% of Montana's total housing stock, rising to about 2.8% during peak visitor season. And this is a trend we looked at too. So while overall impacts on housing remain modest at the state level, these findings certainly show, though, that housing pressures from short-term rentals is localized and strongly seasonal. I want to also point out one of the things we struggle with just at ITRR, and many of us that do statewide research, is all of our communities are so different that it's hard to give like one particular recommendation, right? And so some of the results of this that we'll talk about is that having a statewide policy doesn't make sense because some communities really need short-term rentals. In addition, we are also very aware that short-term rentals policies and regulations are sometimes the only lever communities have to deal with some of the housing pressures. So we know that going in. So when we look at where our short-term rentals concentrated, again, they are highly concentrated in a small number of counties tied to tourism. Two of these counties consistently account for the majority of short-term rental activity statewide. There is a second tier of counties that includes Park, Missoula, and Lake, shows meaningful short-term rental presence, but at a much smaller scale. And we know many of these communities have worked on policies and regulations. This concentration is even more evident when we look at bookings rather than listings. So this is where the data gets really nuanced, how many booking nights. There are sharp peaks during peak tourism season. What this tells us is that short-term rental impacts on housing are highly localized rather than being a statewide issue affecting all communities. Pressures continue to be concentrated in very specific tourism areas. And you can see those top lines there, the blue and the yellow, that is Flathead and Gallatin. So we looked at seasonality because this was another perspective, very clear seasonal patterns. All those peaks are that June through August. You see the sharp increase in both listings and booking nights during the summer months. Gallatin County, though, does show a distinct winter peak, of course, driven by that ski tourism. And then when we look at short-term rentals on housing supply, the key takeaway here is that it affects, it's widely different based on location. Statewide, it's relatively small, right? But that, again, is not part of the whole story. In local communities, it can peak to much higher levels. For example, Park County really stands out. It can account for more than 11% of the county's total housing stock. But when we narrow the analysis to full property, and again, remember when we say full property in this report, that's a unit that could be used for long-term housing. And we struggled with this as researchers because I think maybe many of you would go. My family went to the beach in the summers, and we would rent a 10-bedroom house, right? That's hard to equate with. That would be something a family with 2 kids would rent, right? They would never rent that. It's just way too big of a house. So there were a lot of nuances that were really challenging. So thinking about whether a housing unit really would replace a long-term rental. But other counties such as Lake, Carbon, and Missoula show these moderate increases. So overall, like if we were to say across the state, short-term rentals, we wouldn't say are a big part of the housing stock. Instead, they are highly localized. So some of these key takeaways, it's a very complex housing puzzle. Alina mentioned that people wanted an update to that report. We wanted to know this. We kept getting during the pandemic, and especially a few years after, that tourism and short-term rentals is part of the housing crisis. And while it's certainly a component of it, we kind of go back to that model that we made. It's part of a complex puzzle that had a lot of challenges with it at a very specific, concentrated time. And it's secondary to broader economic and structural factors that shape Montana's housing market. As a result, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Each community needs a data-driven, context-specific approach that balances housing affordability with economic opportunity. Ultimately, affecting housing strategies will depend on ongoing monitoring, as Alina mentioned, adaptable regulations, and sustained engagement with local communities. So with that said, feel free to sign up for our newsletter, stay in the loop, check out our website. We will stop the recording, and then if folks have questions and want to ask, this would be a great time to do that. We appreciate everyone being on the call.